So if we kind of look at this idea of that traditional herbalism organopathy approach to prescribing, and how it's similar or different to the homeopathic approach to organ or just symptom-based prescribing, we're kind of really talking the main differentiation there is about potency and posology. Definitely my experience, my opinion, is if you look at the herbal materia medica and also the homeopathic materia medica, we're talking for the plant part of the homeopathic materia medica at least, a large majority of the medicines we're using in similar situations, similar circumstance. The homeopathic materia medica is going to be more specific in terms of they're looking for these particular symptoms with these particular characterizing bits of information, where the herbal materia medica traditional is a bit less specific, and the contemporary one's much more about biochemistry and constituents and the way that those substances act. But we're all usually talking about the same thing. Definitely more than half of the time, probably more than 3/4 of the time, I think. And so what if we're trying to debate between these two things, how this traditional approach to herbalism and the stuff that Paracelsus and Rademacher and kind of happening there, and homeopathy is different when you look at potency and posology, because we're talking about the dynamization of medicines as being one of the big differences. And so I just want to kind of bring this chart back up. This is a way that I like to present the idea. I think it's just useful to refresh you. You may have seen this one before. But this kind of idea where if you're dealing with a material dose, it's going to affect a larger percentage of the population because it's bigger, basically. So the way that I often explain this to people is if you take all of us here, there's 100 of us here at the moment, say, and out of us, if we give all of us chamomile in a herbal kind of a dose, a large herbal kind of dose, a lot of us are going to respond to it. Maybe it's 85 or 90% of us can have a degree of response to a large herbal dose of chamomile. We swig a whole bunch of it for a couple of days, we're going to notice some response from that. Whereas we get smaller doses, so initially we're talking a material dose but a lesser amount of material dose, which is kind of the green area on your scale here, a lesser number of us are going to respond to that because we don't have the susceptibility, the sensitivity to that particular substance, or the dose is no longer big enough for us to have an effect. And then we start to move into the homeopathic dynamized section, which is the blue section here, and a much lesser number of us are going to respond to that. The twist here, though, is Hahnemann's observation, and the reason why dynamization has become a core thing in homeopathy, is that those who do respond to it have a very strong, deep response to it, because we're basically giving them a highly dynamized, highly dynamic version of the substance, which they've got a very strong, innate susceptibility and sensitivity to. So this idea here that as it gets more dynamic, it has a stronger effect, as a result of being dynamized, but only for people who've got the very specific sensitivity. Which is kind of why if we're using a very large material dose of something, we can use more people are going to get a response from that. But as we get more and more homeopathic or more dynamized version, we need to be more specific with our application. So I think, to me, this kind of is the way that really makes sense to me about the difference between some different methods of prescribing using the same substances. Because if we look at, say, the tissue salts are a wonderful example. Schussler's tissue salts, there's only 12 of them, and they're homeopathically prepared, but only to a very small level. He was using 3X's, 6X's is the most common in dispensaries these days. So they're still on that kind of bridge between material and dynamic. They're still got material substance, quite a lot of material substance in them comparatively, but they're quite dynamized also. Relatively dynamized also, they're in that kind of in between, and there's only 12 of them. So if we look at the tissue salts, we look across the entire population, every single person out there, we could pick one of the tissue salts as being the best fitting for them, for their particular circumstance, which makes them quite broad acting. Where if you took those 12 tissue salts in homeopathic potencies at, say, 10M, there'd be only a very small subset of the global population where those might be indicated for them, where they've got the degree of similarity that a very high potency is going to be useful to them. But when it is, that person getting Calc Sulf 10M is going to have a much stronger effect from one dose of Calc Sulf 10M than if they'd had 50 doses of Calc Sulf 6X over a week-long period. And it's going to be stronger still than if they had just been exposed to Calc Sulf material dose. Natmer is a great one. Sea salt, Natmer, Natrium muriaticum, where we're eating salt all day, every day. Everyone's got some kind of salt exposure. But for the people who are in a Natmer state, once you start to get into a more potentized version, that's when we're going to have a much stronger and much more curative effect because of the fact that it's been dynamized. That's kind of, we're talking about this spectrum where material doses are broader acting and you can be a bit less diagnostically specific, where more dynamic doses are deeper acting but you have to be more diagnostically specific, and that's kind of the trade-off between the two. That's certainly the way that I conceive of them, and to me that makes sense of the different dilution scales. It makes sense of tissue salts and fluorescences and the things which kind of fit in between there. So if we look at Burnett's approach to posology and how he did things, he's known for using low potencies, and because of his approach to prescribing basically, but his writings actually reveal there's quite a whole lot of diversity in the way that he approached things. He's actually quite an eclectic posology prescriber, and probably much more eclectic than other folks who were contemporaries of his era. One analysis was done of one of his publications, and so went through all his cases and what he talked about and kind of counted up what he had done and how so. Saw 3x or lower, accounting for about half of his prescriptions, at 6x to 30C for about a quarter of them, and the remainder from high potencies up to 10M. So he's using quite a broad scope of different potencies. So he's probably more commonly using the quite low potencies, 3x or decimals, than what I think a lot of contemporary English-speaking, at least homeopaths, are doing now. But certainly he's using the range from tinctures, low decimals, all the way up to 10M, all quite commonly. Small material doses, he used more commonly for organ remedies, so he's using tinctures and the low decimals type there. The centesimals and the high potencies he used more commonly for nosodes and what he called constitutional kind of treatment, and probably more technically correct to say fundamental kind of treatment. Describes his prescribing as ranging from 10 drops of other tincture 4 times a day up to a 200C every 8 days, for example. So a bunch of different approaches. If we look at Ian Watson, so Ian Watson's a contemporary practitioner. He writes a little book on kind of guide to the methodologies of homeopathy. It's quite a useful little, just quite small little book, but just a few pages on each different main methodologies. He gives some really good practical advice there. He's a big user of Burnett's methodology, which is why we'll look at his adaptation of that. It's a contemporary adaptation of Burnett methodology in organopathy. So he recommends using mother tinctures or dilutions of up to 6x. Due to the lower degree of symptom similarity. So he says, if you've got with organopathy, you have less symptom similarity, so he gets 6x or lower in his selection of potencies. He follows Burnett's advice and uses 5 drops of mother tincture in water 3 times a day on average, and maybe that reduces down to 2 drops for children. Or if he substitutes that with herbal fluid extracts, which are have a higher concentration than what a homeopathically prepared mother tincture, where you soak the plant in alcohol, he uses 2 to 3 drops instead. So if you want to go to a commercial herbal manufacturer and buy their chamomile in a bottle, you might use 2 to 3 drops of that. Where if you want to get chamomile that's been traditionally prepared, where it's been macerated and soaked in alcohol for so many days, then you might go up to 5 drops instead. He reduces the dose if any new symptoms occur, and that might be because there's a high degree of symptom similarity when that occurs, and so often it's an indication where if someone does have like an aggravation or it develops new symptoms on a herb, it means it probably got a high degree of similarity between that plant and themselves. So you can use a smaller dose, and you may even end up going up to using potentized or dynamized versions for that. Where an organ is weak, he prefers to start an organ medicine initially before progressing on to treat other levels, and that's kind of similar to Burnett, where saying you resolve the organ issue first before you progress onto the whole person kind of treatment. He uses sarcodes rather than an organ medicine when the organ is damaged or removed, its function's been suppressed medically, or if he wants to help reduce medication dependence. So sarcodes is medicines prepared from a healthy tissue. So if someone's got, say, a thyroid gland issue, he might use a herbal tincture or a homeopathic preparation from that using an organopathy approach. But if there's actually damage to the thyroid gland, he might use a sarcode that's been prepared from thyroid gland or thyroid hormone or one of those other kind of options, kind of recognizing the fact that that organ is more compromised, and so that you need a bit more kind of, I guess, artificial assistance than just looking to improve the function of an organ that's there and just not working as well as it could be. For the sarcode method, he uses a French method, and so this is a kind of derived from people who French language. They're inspired by Burnett originally. It's been developed since Burnett's work, where they would use a 3x specifically or a 4c specifically in order to stimulate the function of an organ. So you've got a active thyroid, you want to make it more active, you want to use a 3X or a 4C version of thyroid gland medicine. A 7C to regulate it, so if it's inconsistent or needs to be stabilized, you'd use a 7C, or a 9C to inhibit. So if you've got hyperthyroidism and you want to kind of slow its action down, you could use thyroid gland, but use a 9C or other variations from that. That's kind of a based on like the Aunt Short principle, where small doses stimulate, large doses suppress, and that's the particular potency which the a French school of homeopathy has developed, which has been in use for a long time. Another similar method worth keeping in mind is drop dosing. So this is actually a herbalism method, but it shares so much together with homeopathy. It's really, I think, really useful to be aware of it and look at the literature for sure. This is a traditional method of more holistic Western herbalism that's attracted renewed interest in contemporary herbalism. It's become significantly more popular, I think, over the last maybe 10 years or so than what it was 30 years ago. And they use repetitions of small doses, often 1 to 3 drops of herb at a time, to stimulate self-healing ability. So same as homeopathy, they use herbs in the same way as kind of more orthodox herbalism, where they're looking at larger doses at least, but they more recognise that they say, well, rather than the herb doing the effect, it's stimulating the self-healing. They talk about rebound effect and secondary action and other things, which is much more like homeopathy. I think it's the same way that Burnett's like a bridge between herbalism and homeopathy. I think contemporary drop dosing is based on the older traditional herbalism, based on kind of Ranamaker and Paracelsus kind of thinking, but it's kind of like a bridge also between homeopathy and herbalism, so really useful stuff in there. They use a more traditional diagnostic framework and recognise that secondary action of herbs, also with a focus on energetics. So they use some of those classification methodologies like humoral classification, or hot herbs and dry herbs and moist herbs and that kind of stuff. They use characteristic symptoms to differentiate and prescribe, often single medicines, so they might still go through the similar approach to homeopathy, where they're trying to find which one specific herb is best indicated for that person, and using characterizing symptoms, or sometimes I've heard them call it specific symptoms, which is equivalent to what we in homeopathy would call a characteristic symptom, to differentiate between similar herbs and pick one which is the best for this particular person. They've got a bit of a focus on recognising the essence of herbs, as well as that within its framework it's got constitutional herbal prescribing. So like, this person is a pulsatilla kind of person within the herbal methodology, very similar to what we do in homeopathy, where we say this person is a pulsatilla kind of a constitution. And Matthew Wood's a great example of that. I recommend, if you're interested in this, have a look at some of his material. He's got, I don't know, 8 or 9 books or so, really kind of useful stuff, and he's a really good example of incorporating homeopathic materia medica and herbal materia medica, and recognizing kind of the similarities between the way they're approaching things, and kind of selecting between different places on the potency scale, from gross doses. He'll even use the larger, more material doses on occasions. Drop dosing herbalism, which is his main kind of thing, versus dynamized, homeopathically prepared versions of substances, and kind of selecting between them. So his stuff's really interesting and quite detailed too. There's a lot of really useful stuff in them. Something important to keep in mind though, if you are thinking about using herbal level of substances in this approach, is the safety issues that goes with that. Even small material doses have the possible potential for toxicity or interactions, which are generally not a concern in potentized homeopathic prescribing. This is not a large concern, because with drop dosing the dose is still quite small, and most of the herbs which have got traditional uses have got traditional use because they're relatively safe. It's pretty rare to have a herb where there's significant concerns attached to it, especially in this kind of size dosing. But there is the potential for material interactions, which is different than the potential in homeopathic, so it's worthwhile kind of remaining really wary of that, or remaining aware of that. When used at material doses, it's good to always consider the potential for those sort of reactions and investigate potential contraindications or possible sensitivities. And if in doubt, or if there's interactions which might otherwise prevent prescribing a substance you want to use a low decimal potency as an alternative to tincture. And that's what I would do. I almost never, I can't remember even the last time I prescribed someone a herbal prepared medicine internally, because I don't feel like I've got the sufficient expertise to do that. I use herbs externally more commonly, using arnica and calendula and hypericum and that kind of stuff for topical applications on occasions. But when I'm doing internal prescribing, I would tend to use like a low dose, like a 3x or something like that, rather than a mother tincture, because I don't feel like I personally have the sufficient expertise that I would do that. And also think if I'm going to get much the same effect for a 3x compared to a hepatic mother tincture, where it's relatively low concentration compared to a fluid extract, then why would I not just use a 3x and be less concern myself with the potential for interactions? I feel more safety attached to that. So that's just Greg's personal opinion for whatever it's worth. I'll put that in there as something for you to think about.